Right, hello, flagelling cum buckets. Not in. I've had so many problems with OBS today. It's not even funny. I'm having to do this on monitor capture, not window capture. So a lot of the magic might be removed. Like you won't see. All your music will be coming on when I put it on, and you'll see me put it on. But hey, doesn't matter. We'll crack on with it. And I did promise to do a full-on presentation on the Saga world, the world that we are using for the role-playing campaign. Because I've had a lot of emails, people saying, want to know more about it. It sounds like quite an interesting setting to do things in, and I'm fine with doing that. That's okay. I'm, a little nervous, obviously, because I've never really done anything like this before on my own. It's always been me and a few others who have been on stream, and this is the first time I've actually done it myself, so that goes to show. I think I'll talk about the general overview of the world and different states, religions and things like that, and I think we might do a video in future where we have everyone's characters in the same room. We can just talk about them and what their aims are and what they want to do with life and stuff, and we might do the same thing for Minerva, but Minerva's due for a heavy update soon. Forgive me for switching back and forth. I know you're going to be seeing everything, and it's highly immersion breaking, I know, but nothing I can do, to be honest. It's OBS's fault. It's a piece of shit. So I guess we'll get started. Because you haven't got all day. Let me just take a sip of my cup of tea and we'll get going. Okay. Alright. So, the world of Saga then. It's basically a fantasy role-playing setting, and when I say fantasy, there's very little magic, there's very little in the way of otherworldly powers. They're certainly in the setting, but they're not like one of the mainstays of the setting. I'm not a big magic fan. I think a lot of fantasy writers try to use it as a crutch, so to speak, because magic is a big thing. A lot of the times when you'll play things like Dragon Age, a lot of the evil that's in Dragon Age is blamed on demons. Oh, our demons infested his mind. It's well, why are you doing that? Why can't you just tell a human story? Why can't it be he's just a man? And it's very interesting how these people tend to do debauched, horrible things for the people in the name of power, in the name of right. That's interesting. That's the human heart in conflict with itself, as George Martin said, and it's the most interesting story that you can tell. Just blaming something on demons or magic or whatever is boring to me, which is one of the main reasons that the main religion of the central continent of Saga, the Spire Church, is so against. It blames magic for, or the binding as it's known in Saga. It blames the binding for a lot of the ills of humankind without really looking deeper into it and saying, well, no, just some people are just assholes, and that's just how it works. I think you can. So this is a general overview of what we're going to be talking about. We got the going to do a general overview, which I'm going to do in a minute. Then we'll go on the realms and states of Saga. We'll do religion, and we'll do the creatures and the state of technology that are in the world. Just the general overview. I think we'll go more in depth as we go along, and generally, I think everything's going to be pretty good if we do it that way. Okay, so general overview. Piece of art. Oh, by the way, if people can see art on this video that is yours, or maybe somebody whose it is, or where I've got it from, please tell me, because I have gotten in touch with a lot of the people whose artwork I'm using and have their blessing, but there is like 3 or 4 of them which I haven't, because I've simply not been able to get any contact information for them. So if you could get me their contact information, and I'll give them full credit and stuff like that. But 2 of these pieces of artwork are done by friends of mine. The rest are taken from the internet almost entirely, and just used as they're not wholly representative of what's in my head, but it's just something nice to have in the background so you can get your imagination working. And I also use them for illustrators who come in and do stuff with the world and stuff. They can look and see round about what I'm thinking of in my mind's eye. So, general overview. The world of Saga actually has 4 continents, all vastly different, and unlike our world today, where or many other fantasy settings where the further north you go, the colder it is, and the further south you go, the warmer it is. In fact, in Saga, it's actually the way around. The further north you go, the hotter it gets, and the further south you go, the colder it gets. And that's because all the land in Saga, on the planet of Saga, is actually fairly low down on the equatorial line, and so the further north you go, the hotter it gets. The equator is actually a little bit above Kaldanium, which is the main actual setting of most of our campaigns and stories. So yeah, that's basically the world. They're vastly different climates. Like in the west, we have entire up in Kaldanian, and so it's the west is very much a verdant grassland. Imagine the plains of Italy at their height, the Po Valley, things like that. Crops being grown all over the place. It's a huge, vast cacophony of basically grain, wheat, all sorts of different things growing, and verdant rivers coming down through most of what is called Valenreath. That is the west. And it was in the west that humankind first came into the world. And when I say came into the world, there's no magic behind it. They just evolved there. Tens of thousands of years ago, they evolved there and started building tribes, building communities, and spreading out all over the rest of the world. And it was in the west, thousands of years later, that the first true powers of humankind in a form of statehood actually rose up to be what they are. And the ancient city of Velrod, which is probably the oldest city in the world, is over there, and it's on the western coast of Valenreath, which is the western continent of Reath it's called. And the people of the city were incredibly rich, incredibly haughty, incredibly arrogant in their own power, so to speak, and quite rightly so. I mean, that theirs was the most advanced. That they developed stone working quicker than anyone else. They developed steel working quicker than anyone else. They developed pretty much every single technology that can be thought of. They developed first, and they looked upon the rest of the West. And we'll have maps eventually. I do have a map sitting here on my desk, but we will get one up eventually. But in the West, Velrod realised that most of the other city-states in the West, places like the Amberduchies and places like that, weren't conquerable by military might. It was too disparate. People were too argumentative. It was just alliances were shift on the wind. And so they needed to impress the rest of the continent into joining with them. And so they went to the sea. They looked into the sea, and the people of Valenreath at this time were incredibly powerful binding users, which is the stand-in for magic in this world. And the binding lords of Velrod looked to the sea, looked to the Ocean of Embers. It wasn't called the Ocean of Embers at that time, but it is now. And they saw 4 jagged pieces of rock, gargantuan pieces of rock in the sea. And on these, they raised 4 townships, which they eventually closed together using the binding. And they gave birth to the city of Valen. And Valen is known to most historians in Saga as the mother of the world. It's the city of wonders. It's what you're seeing now on the screen in my head. It's a fuzzy picture, but it was one that I thought did Valen quite a lot of justice. In that it's a city raised above the sea, taken from the sea, built on the sea, out into the Ocean of Embers. The Ocean of Embers is a massive cyan plain of water, and so you can imagine this twinkling jewel of a city just off the coast of verdant grasslands, and just off the coast of those grasslands is this twinkling jewel. And at one end of the city there is a huge dome, which is where the Spire Church first came into being. And well, the Spire Church didn't first come into being there. They first came into being in Valenreef, the actual continent itself, in the middle of the continent, in a place called the Tiers, which is where many rivers plough into the centre of the continent. And it was here that most of the household gods of the more dominant household gods of Valenreef were combined into one pantheon called the Spire Church. And the Spire Church held a dome, a massive dome, on one end of the city of Valen, and whilst the Palace of Embers was on the other side, which was the ruling seat of the then Lord of Valen, who was the lord of both cities. He was the lord of Velrod and Valen, and the feat of this was so astronomical that most duchies around the twin cities actually declared allegiance to them. And from then on in, it was pretty much a snowballing effect. Like all of the West was unified under this one enlightened, burgeoning empire until finally, I'm not going to go into names because this is just a rough guide, until finally the Lord of Valen at the time declared himself the first Valenrethian emperor, which basically meant that the entire continent in the West was under the sway of the mother of the world, this massive city that was born out of the sea, basically. And from there on in, the Valenrethians looked upon the rest of the world pretty much, not that interested until their own resources started to be stretched by the wondrous cities that they were building all over their continent. They needed more land, they needed more territory, they needed more resources, so they eventually spread west. They spread across the world. They spread, sorry, not west, east. Sorry, I'm looking at the map the wrong way around. They spread east, across what is known as the Breaking Seas. And across the Breaking Seas to the east is the central continent of the world, which is called Caledanian. And but basically, in a sort of cheesy reformation, the Caledanian in the Valenrethian tongue means Dragonland, because on Caledanian was where 90%, if not all, of the dragons in the world of Saga are born, and it's where they come from, and it's where they roost. And the first, the Valenrethian Empire at this stage forged a war of conquest to take over Caledanian, the central continent, from the old clans. The old clans are basically an amalgamation of people who kept to their own noble houses. They kept to their own sort of ways of life. It was very Celtic, very tribal society. Most of them nomads, until the Valenrethians came. When the Valenrethians came, the war began in earnest, and eventually, long story short, the Valenrethians conquered Caledanian and made it a province. And they did this they went further east as well. They went further east across the Silver Seas, which are beyond Caledanian, towards the eastern empires of Gensen and Menshai. And in a tumult of bloody warfare, they actually conquered those lands. And so at one stage, the Valenrethian Empire pretty much held what is known as the entire civilized world within its borders. And then came quite a happy, pseudo-happy and prosperous time, where the Valenrethian Empire pretty much ruled all with the power of the binding, with the power of magic. They ruled all of the civilized lands in the world, and they held all of the resources under one banner. And great roads were carved across the world, the straight road from city to city, which greatly benefited trade. There was medicines were advanced, incredibly advanced for a medieval setting which this is. and great works of art and great works of engineering achievement were sprouting up all over the world. And that was until an actual event known as the Valenfall occurred, where a massive earthquake struck beneath the city of Valen itself, and causing massive tidal waves and massive cataclysmic destruction, which pulled the city essentially back under the sea, killing the entire Imperial line. Everyone dead. So let's think about it. I mean, Valen is the capital of the entire empire, and now the entire upper echelon of the empire is dead in one day. It's in a cataclysm of fire and water. It's pulled underneath the sea, and still no one knows to this day what caused it. Many speculate that it was an earthquake that caused a tsunami, which pretty much destroyed the city. Some people say that the binding users of the city were experimenting in things that they shouldn't. But the only thing that really survives is the fact that the city was destroyed and the world descended into chaos, into generations of bloodshed, as people fought over the scraps of this empire. And eventually, in the centre of this empire, 4 noble houses banded together and defeated what was, at this time, the greatest military force in the world in the Silver Legion. The Silver Legion being the military army of the Valenrethian Empire, which at this stage was called the First Empire. And the Kaldanians actually annihilated the Silver Legion in Kaldanian and declared themselves free, and then upon doing so turned on each other, which only added to the chaos. And eventually the Spire Church, which had survived, the remnants of it which had survived the Valenfall, made their way across Valenreath and across the sea toward Kaldanian, and there they were accepted by many of the new converts who had converted to the religion. And the Spire Church decreed that it was the binding, it was magic that had destroyed Valen, that had destroyed the mother of the world and created all of this chaos. And eventually all 4 of the noble houses in Kaldanian signed a pact called the Silken Bandage, which essentially hammered out their own borders with the blessing of the Spire Church. The Spire Church was given a great fortress within the mountains of Creed in the centre of Kaldanian, called the White Spire, which they hold to this day. And the Kaldanian Kaeldoms, because there are no kings in Kaldanian, they're all Kaels, which is different from being a king, but we'll discuss that at a later date. They were hammered out in the north-west there was Raedmere, in the north-east there was Morvaid, in the south-west Cainmar, and in the south-east Caer Vale. And again, the further south you go in Kaldanian, the colder it gets, the further north you go, the hotter it gets. So Morvaid is pretty much made up of many different sort of imperial sympathisers, really. The Morvadians were the people who were entrusted with guarding Kaldanian by the First Empire, the Valenrethian Empire, and they took on many of their customs. And so the Morvaid is, when you look at it in the north east of Kaldanian, it's one of the warmest Kaeldoms, but it's also one of the most militaristic and one of the most recognisably European medieval society. The rest all have their own quirks, but Morvaid is probably the most powerful. It has its own version of the Silver Legion and the Crimson Legion and all that sort of thing. To the west of it is Raedmere, and these are pretty much horsemen. The Raedmerians have always been horsemen. They've held to their nomadic tribal ways that were prevalent with the old clans back in the day. To the south of them, in the southwest, is Cainmar, and these are sea raiders. The Cainmarians are people who emigrated to Kaldanian from the far south, which is a snow-blasted land called Shardland. And these Shardlanders emigrated to Kaldanian and forged their own state in the end with the signing of the Silken Bandage in Cainmar. All of these Kaeldons will be explained in further detail And next to Cainmar, in the southeast, is Caer Vale, and Caer Vale is pretty much a verdant grassland, but the on the the southern half is like tundra, very cold tundra, and the further north you go in this vast plain, the warmer it gets, and then the more fertile the ground is. And Caer Vale is pretty much a combination of England and France at their height in the medieval era. And so yeah, those are the four Caeldoms, and that's where most of the action in most of our campaigns takes place. In the current campaign, we're actually going to Valenreath, which is fantastic. Eventually, we'll get there. So yeah, I think that's ancient history. What you're looking at now are statues created by the Valenreathians called the Lamenters, and they look out onto the Ocean of Embers to the dead city of Valen, which is not on the picture but is just off the coast, which has been annihilated by the waves. And the Valenreathians have actually placed these sentinels there to watch over the ghosts. You can see how the landscape is torn and shredded where this great calamity occurred, and the Valenreathians always hold this place with great sorrow and sadness, and then the Lamenters are the centerpiece of that. They look out to sea, and they look over the dead city of Valen, which is still just under the waves. If you were to sail over it now, you could see most of the buildings below you. They've been preserved by the binding underneath the water, but most of it's been annihilated and blasted away. So, okay, we can move on. This is a picture I found on the internet, which is quite nice. I figure it's the border between Caer Vale and Cainmar in southern Caeldanian, and that's the idea of the sort of landscape and the climate of this world. You know, it's basically Europe. It's basically Europe. It's basically a representation of medieval Europe. It doesn't look like Europe on the map, but the climates are very European, but only the further south you go, the colder it gets. The Cainmar is very much a place of jagged mountains, and if there are plains, they're all tundra. And this is basically the Caer Vale border between them. You're looking at the one of the toes of the mountains of Creed. So if you were to follow the mountains in this general direction up here for there'd probably be about 300 leagues, you'd finally get to the White Spire, which is where the Spire Church holds court to this day. And when you look at the state of the world as it is, I mean, this this calamity happened centuries and centuries and centuries ago, and since then the Caeldoms have grown in power and have warred against foreign powers, but not really with each other. The Valenreathians have denounced their own emperors and have basically slaughtered their own emperors and cast them out. They were led by a man named Echios Carrion, who basically denounced the empire as being weak at the time. This is a couple of hundred years after the Valenfall. He denounced the empire as being weak, and he, with his incredible binding power, annihilated the city of Emberhold, which was the new capital of the Valenreathian Empire. The Valenreathian Empire at this stage was only in the west. You know, it had been pushed back from the rest of the world after the Valenfall, in the chaos that followed. And Echios Carrion basically set himself up as the leader of the 9 ministers, and the 9 ministers took over Valenreath, and to this day their descendants rule. In Caeldanian, as I said, you know, that they've warred with foreign powers, but never really with each other. Trade flourishes in Caeldanian, and this is one picture that I think really does demonstrate really well what Caeldanian is. It's verdant grasslands, it's vast open spaces coupled with rushing cyan rivers, huge imposing mountain ranges, And yeah, I really hope we get to do a map at some stage, because I think you know, you guys will really appreciate the pictures if you can have a map to look at and you can pinpoint and say, oh, that's where that is, you know. And because I'm looking at a map now and I can definitely see where this is, and yeah, it's a cool world. It's a cool world. Okay, this is actually what I imagined the entrance to the White Spire would look like. Ironic, because the spire behind the two figures in the centre, the two statues, is actually black on this because of the silhouette. But this is high up in the mountains of Creed, hundreds of leagues away from where I was showing you on the last picture, to the north. And the statues are actually carved into the side of the rock, and you can see a pilgrim here on his way to the White Spire, which stands imposing in the centre of these mountain ranges. And the White Spire itself, in the years after the Valen fall, actually stamped out much of the binding in Keldanian, and for some reason a lot of the creatures and a lot of the more fantastical powers in this world, the less binding users that there were in the world, which were being stamped out by the Spire Church, the more these powers waned, the more these powers receded from the world, until now binding powers are incredibly rare. You hardly ever see them, and if you do see them in Keldanian, most people will report you to a group called the Sentinels, who are the chamber militant of the Spire Church. And the Sentinels either shut binding users away and sequester them away so they can't be a danger to anyone, or they straight up kill them straight away. So tribes of subhumans like Wolfen, who are my world version of werewolves, and Longfangs, which are my world version of vampires, they've died away, and they're now incredibly rare to see and come across. They did used to wander around Keldanian in tribes, and Keldanian is the place where most of the magical and fantastical oddities of the world were. No one actually knows why. But the binding has always had a very strong influence on Keldanian, even though it was Valenreath in the west that first fermented and pushed its use. But in Keldanian now, the binding is repressed, and anyone sheltering a binding user is risking death by the pyre, death by burning, by the Spire Church. So yeah, the Spire Church ironically started in the west, and ironically started in a place where the binding is not just respected, but it's essential to climb the social ladder in Valenreath. You get nowhere unless you're a binding user, and it's still like that to this day. And in the aftermath of the Valenfall, the Spire Church were actually cast out from Valenreath. They were accused of bringing the doom down upon Valen, or not being able to appease the gods in such a way that they did Mother of the World away. And so basically the Spire Church and Valenreath blame each other for the Valenfall. They blame each other. The Spire Church blames the Valenreathians for Valen being destroyed, for their blasphemous use of the binding, which is a power of the gods, they say, and not for men. And the Valenreathians state that the Spire Church failed in their duty to appease the gods. And the Valenreathians today have rejected almost all religion. There are no religions in Valenreath, only science, only the binding, only logic. And so the Valenreath is now a very, very cold, logical place, but probably the largest place in the world that allows slavery. Slavery is still a thing in Valenreath, it's not in Keldanian. And yeah, that's pretty much the binding as it is. The binding is standing for magical power in Saga. You can be immensely powerful in the binding, ridiculously so, to the point where you can influence the fates of entire kingdoms if you wish, or Kael'doms as the case may be. And so it's feared. It's feared throughout the world, apart from Valenreath, where it's embraced and accepted. So, just hold on for a second whilst I sort something out. There we are. back again. Okay, so moving on. Caldanian and the West. So Caldanian being the central continent and Valenreath being in the West aren't the only continents in this world. On the East, there's the continent of it's the Mist Continent. On the Mist Continent is an empire just as old, if not older, than the Valenreathian Empire, and that's the Empire of Menshai, which is based on medieval imperial China. And it's a massive place, a huge place full of huge grain fields, wheat fields growing, rice paddies everywhere. And if you can imagine medieval China turned up to 11 and spread out over hundreds and thousands of leagues, you've got the Empire of Menshai, which was created quite organically from a central city-state called Menshai and spread out over the east. Their northern neighbours are the principalities of Gensen, and Gensen are based on medieval Japan. And these two peoples in Saga are as divided as their real-life counterparts. A general went north from Menshai to quell the northern principalities and bring them underneath the empire hundreds of years ago, until he found or started to believe that he was the prophet of the Lord that quenches the sun, or the Quench Lord, who is the main pantheon god of Menshai. He declared himself as prophet, and the people of Gensen rose up behind him and declared their independence now and forevermore under the High Prince, who is this general. And he defeated Menshai several times before establishing his own independence, and Gensen was independent for a long time after that, centuries in fact. In the east, they have a very, very cool respect for the Valenreathian Empire, even though, you know, the Valenreathian Empire came here in ancient times to annihilate and conquer, and they did that. They conquered the people of Menshai and Gensen. But at the same time, once the Caldanians had annihilated the Valenreathian armies in the field, the Easterners pretty much declared themselves independent and won their independence without fighting a battle, essentially. And so, trade in the east is everything. They still use the old Valenreathian road, which cut straight right through. They call this road the Silk Road, which is based on the real-life Silk Road, and it goes from one end of the continent to the other. And it basically cuts from one end to the other, and nothing is more important in Menshai and in the east than trade. And the bloodlines of the emperors and princes of this line have remained static and have remained in power for centuries and thousands of years. And the status quo is the main thing that really holds this entire place together. It's the fact that everybody has a place, everybody has a set role in society, and social movement isn't really possible in the East. You know, everyone's happy with the status quo apart from the slaves, but who cares about them? You know, it's the East itself. Its past is more shrouded than the Valenreathian history, because the Valenreathian history is the history of the world. The Valenreathians conquered the world, whereas a lot of the historical facts about Menshai were actually lost when they were conquered by the Valenreathians, and their doctrines replaced by Valenreathian doctrines which have since, of course, been quashed and sent out for proper Eastern Quench Lord doctrines. In the city of Menshai itself is actually the largest in the world. It's a medieval city of 5 million inhabitants, and if you can imagine Rome at its height in the ancient period, and at its very, very, very height, just had over 1 million people, So this is a city that's 5 times Rome's imperial size at its imperial height. It is a gargantuan place, and this is you're looking at one of the port entrances to the river that runs by Menshai itself, the city of Menshai, and it's I mean, as I said, trade governs all. Trade governs all in the East. And that's... Nobody's really conquered the East since the Valenrethian Empire. Not unless we look towards the folk of the northern continent of Saga. Now, up until now, we've conquered the civilized lands. Covered the civilized lands. We've covered Valenreath in the west. We've covered Kildanian in the centre of the world, and we've covered Menshai and Gensen in the east, which is on the Mist continent in the east. To the north, and bear in mind, the further north you go, the hotter it gets, are the sun-blasted plains of the Nairim riders, and these are nomadic tribesmen who ride around the north, generally raping, pillaging and stealing from each other, into petty empires, one called the Empire of 9 Stars and one called the Empire of 9 Moons, and they fight with each other, but not much is known about them apart from that. They have their own culture, they have their own ways of life, and they're completely alien to everyone else in the world. Beyond them still is the vast expanse of the brimstone deserts, and the brimstone deserts are death. They are death incarnate. There is nothing that can live there apart from around one of the 12 massive oases that are in the north, in the Brimstone Desert. And these oases actually spawned city-states around them as people flocked to them, to their vast reserves of fresh water. And the greatest of these is a city called Asunda. And a man called Akira Akerod actually rose to power in Asunda and conquered the other cities of the oases in the north into what was called the Asunda Pact. And the Asunda basically hammered down south. They raged south towards Gensen, and in generations of warfare they conquered Gensen completely and lashed it under their rule. Now, the inspiration for the Asunda are actually the Mongolians, and I've placed the Mongolian kind of power in the desert simply because I wanted this group of people to be unknown, to be a race of people who strike fear into everyone else. They literally do. I mean, they are pragmatic, and they literally only respect strength. The Asunda only respect strength, but anyone can apply to be an Asunda. Anyone can apply to be a part of their Brimstone Empire. Absolutely anyone, and everyone underneath their banner is afforded respect and is afforded opportunities, but you just aren't afforded elsewhere in the world. And so I wanted to bring a misnomer here, in that yes, they are incredibly frightening. Yes, they do put hundreds of thousands of people to the sword without a second thought. Yes, they are demonized by the rest of the world, but when one actually looks at it, the social structure, if you are taken over by the Asunda, is a lot more fluid than it is in Menshai. It's a lot more fluid than it is in Kildanian, and it's a hell of a lot more fluid in the binding dominated west of Valenreath. The Gensen, the Asunda are peerless horsemen. They are empire builders, and they're ruthless in that. And they are a new force. They are a new force in Saga. They have just their empire is relatively new, and the rest of the world pretty much looks at it very nervously. They look at the Gensen and what's happened there, and the fact that yes, there is resistance to Asunda rule, but there's also quite a lot of that resistance that died away quite quickly. So, what you're looking at now is actually the entrance to Jupei, which is one of the main central trading cities of Menshai. And Menshai, as you can imagine, is extremely nervous. Their emperor is extremely nervous about the growing power that is at his northern border, which is at the first, I'm sure he was delighted. Well, his line was delighted with Gensen being humbled in such a way, but now that Gensen's become part of the Brimstone Empire, it now looks incredibly like Menshai will be its next target. But it's not all heat. It's not all heat and blazing suns and noble horse riders. To the south is a continent called the Last Continent, or the Lost Continent, whichever one people prefer. And earlier on I mentioned Shardlanders who founded Cainmar. Well, these Shardlanders came from the south, and the south is known as Shardland. And it's on the Lost Continent, or the Last Continent, as I mentioned before. And this is a continent that is actually drifting away from the rest. It's massive, and it's drifting south. It's drifting further into the ice caps. It's drifting further into the frozen, dead south, basically. And so it's a dying culture. It's a culture which has sprouted many a strong warrior, and it's a culture that's given birth to raiders and seamen of peerless renown. These are men and women who raided countless coastlines, and they are tempered by where they come from. They are tempered by the cold. These people are steel. They are absolute steel, rugged steel in the face of everything. And states like Cainmar in southern Keldanian, which were settled by Shardlanders who came across the sea, they are states and cities and places like that are the states of necessity, because most people in Shardland, they need to get away from the Lost Continent, because it is being just that, lost. Every single piece of arable land, every single piece of resource, every single resource in the south is being taken away from them slowly, steadily, as it recedes into the south. And their pantheon is actually not not the Spire Church at all, or that of the East. It's actually based around winter. It's actually, winter is the great enemy of their race. They any god of fire is popular with them. The most being Kendon, who is Lord of the Sky, who is their sole deity, and he takes the form of a wandering old man with his hood up and a cloak on, and he carries what's called the hearth fire, which is a fire on the end of a stick, which he brings. He stole that from Winter. It was a miracle guarded jealously by Winter, but Kendon stole it and gave it to his people to make sure that they could survive in the frostbitten south. And it's a religion that's permeated to such a degree that everyone in the south, across the seas, actually has every single village has an empty house with a hearth that is always blazing with fire. And this empty house is given over to Kendon. Nobody else is allowed to go in there, because the people of Shardland actually believe that Kendon wanders between the holds. He wanders between these distant villages and outcropped cities to bring stories to them, and to bring news, and to bring light and life to these places. And one house in every city, one house in every township is given over to him, and has always remained empty and always cleaned and always stocked with food and welcome. And the city that is the largest city in the south is actually the one that is furthest to the south, and it's a city ruled by the last lord, who is known as the King of Kings. He's the High King of all of the Shardlander kings, and it is his line that has been chosen to remain on the lost continent forever. They will always be there until finally they all die out. When the continent drifts so far to the south that everything's caked in ice and nothing survives, they will be the last left here. The Shardlanders are evacuating their continent because it's dying. It's drifting further to the south and no one quite knows why. There are many theories, many scientists and many archaeological diggers have come up with theories, one being that the cataclysm that began this drift to the south was actually the great eruption that claimed Velen so many years ago. But those are only theories. What is known is that this is a dying continent. It's a dying continent that's drifting further to the south and will be carpeted in ice and death before long. It has barely a few centuries of life left in it, and the great exodus of people has seen conflicts sprout up all across these southern borders of Keldanian, where Shardlanders have landed and tried to stake out claims of their own. I mean, the free Canaan Duchy in southern Caer Vale is actually land given over to the Shardlanders when they arrived in such droves that they sparked the Dance of the Shard Kings, which was a huge war fought between Caer Vale and the invading Shardlanders. And even though the Shardlanders were defeated in that war, they were given vast swathes of land in the south to live in, simply because there were so many of them there that the Caer of Caer Vale just simply had no choice. He had to give over land because they were going nowhere. They couldn't go home because that would be a death sentence. They said they would rather die on a Caer Valian soil. If people get confused about the names, I understand, because Keldanian and Caer Vale, they're very similar, but Caer Vale is the Caeldom that is within Keldanian. So there we go. So that's basically the south. It's a picture of the east of the that's the Asunda, a picture of the Asunda, one of the cities in the north. It's always a picture that I've really liked. So yeah, and so the Saga really, I mean, we've covered all of the places now in a general overview. Saga is a place of vast difference, and the actual world itself, although it has magic and it has dragons and it has fantastical things, I hope now that you get some sort of semblance that in fact it's the cultures of this world, it's the people within it and how they interact and how they react with each other and how history goes along, that really gives the world its credence. Magic takes a back seat in Saga. It's there, but it's in the background. It's the human heart in conflict with itself which takes centre stage. And there's a last picture there. Next time, because I will do another video, we'll do more in depth on the conflicts that have rocked the world from time to time. Because I have left a lot out. This has been a general overview. This has been a general smorgasbord of different cultures, states and times. And if I've been unclear, I do apologise. You know, this is my first time doing this, and I just wanted to do it for you all because it means a hell of a lot to me that people actually want to know about this world and they want to know why it means so much to me. I've spent literally upwards of 15 years with this world, and it's been an evolving process, and it's evolved from being a very fantastical setting to having things stripped out and redone and rehashed. And I look at it like it's like the waves on a shore. Like the waves come up, because I didn't amend Saga, I gutted it several times. I'd get so far writing the world guide, and then I'd gut it and start all the way over again. And it's sort of like waves going up a beach and getting further each time, but then pulling all the way back, and then getting further again and pulling all the way back. It was sort of like that. until finally a little while ago I wrote a 50,000 word description of the world and the history, which I've just rifled through in about 10 minutes. Well, longer than 10 minutes, but you get what I mean. And that was the world that we did our first role-playing campaign in, called the Ventier campaign, which I will go over. We will do a video on that, but this is mainly the introduction video. It's the video on basically the general overview of the world and the history and where things come from and where cultures are. And my last guide was a lot shorter than 50,000 words. It was about 35,000 words, but it had artwork this time, and most of it was actually by people who I know, which was a huge boon to me. And it's amazing that people want to take time to live in this place and to add to it. Please do add to it, by the way. If you can, as long as you don't change any of the chronological history, go for it. You want to write a short story, do it. You know, if you want to do your own campaign, go and do it. You want to do artwork, as long as you let me see it, so I can just glory in what you're doing. I don't care how good or how bad it is. You know, if you're the worst writer in the world, I don't care. Just come in and, you know, have a look around and let your imagination run riot. That's what this world's all about. So, guess the only thing left to say is thanks for watching, and we will do another video. I will go more in depth. I'll probably do state by state more in depth. So we'll do probably Valenreath first, because it's the most important historically, and then we'll move on to other places. We'll do each of the great Caeldoms of central Caeldania in detail. We'll do the east, we'll do the north, we'll do the south, we'll do everything. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and hope you come back for more. Sorry if I blabbed on. You're about to see my desktop as well, because I've had to do monitor capture for this. So, but hey, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you guys soon.